and the tradition of tradition in Croatian archaeology. From what we heard today and yesterday is that we all have similar problems in common, that we are all facing and working with very complex stories, but with very similar outcomes, which is basically that our current practices in archaeology are still rooted in the old narratives, old knowledge, and the need to address them is, I guess, why we are all here now. So each of us face these problems from different perspective, and the various aspects of tradition will be my perspective. Okay, so tradition is really an important part of Croatian nation, Croatian identity, Croatian state. It, as it is in much other countries. It is transferred and inherited through generation. It presents one of our biggest values, both on personal, family, and state level. And it is regarded as one of the building blocks of, and it is our duty to nurture it and to protect it at all costs. So this is one of the main perspectives how we see the tradition. There are many various lines, many different traditions, and here I will address three of them. I chose to address three of them, and I will address them from very small, very limited stories based in archaeological research on prehistory, more specific Neolithic. So you will see that even though I try to divide them in three different types of traditions, that they are all interconnected, and in the each example that I will present here, that you can see, if not all three, then at least two of them present. And each of these traditions have its counterpart in the archaeological research. So the traditions that I will discuss here is that Croatia is part of Mittel Europa, that Croatia is part of Western sphere, Western world, the influence of patriarchy, and more important here in this topics of archaeology that I will address the question of authority. And the third one is Croatia, or the part of Croatia, being ante murale Christianitatis, the bulwark of Western civilized world, which is the image of our country that is still very much present in contemporary public sphere. Before I start, just a speed overview of Croatian history. From 12th century onwards, Croatia was part till the end of the First World War. Croatia was part of Hungary and Austro-Hungary, and in the end, Austro-Hungarian Empire. And that period and those countries are regarded to some extent as oppressors, but our attitude towards those periods and those countries are mostly positive, as they are seen as the beacons of culture and progress. For example, even today, you can hear that people are talking, oh, if it weren't for them, we wouldn't have cadastral maps and stuff like that. Then after the war with the Ottomans, the Ottoman expansion, some parts of Croatia are, like many other parts of Europe, formed as military outposts and the borderline between, the borderline with the Ottoman Empire. And this This period and this organization of territory formed this idea about the antemurale Christianitatis. As you all know, it is not the term that is coined especially for this part, but all other parts of Europe that were borderline in certain period. But it formed a very strong influence in Croatian culture, in literature, in um, art, if you want, and also it was very important part in the creation of Croatian national identity in the 19th century, and also maintained a very important part of Croatian national identity. Then, of course, we have Yugoslavia, who even Croatia was part of it for several decades. It is regarded as much more negative union than the previous one. It is often called like a dungeon of nations. I guess that some of my colleagues will, from other countries, will also find this term familiar. Even it is to some extent name that it is not spoken of. For example, if we talk about Croatia in 19th century, people will say Austro-Hungarian Empire, but if you talk about 70s, even in official documents, it will be sometimes regarded as the ex-state. So this is a short overview of the history that formed very much also the archaeological research and archaeological practices. What I will talk about here today is Neolithic and Copper Age Analytic period in Croatia and how these traditions are influenced. In Neolithic archaeology in Croatia, there is a strong German tradition because like in many Balkan countries, first researchers were educated in Austria and in Germany. But this strong German tradition persisted up until contemporary times. And even when I was a student, we were told at the university that you cannot be an archaeologist if you do not speak German. Um, in my earlier versions of presentation, I didn't mention Marxism influence at all because there was almost none of it, but I put it after yesterday's presentation. But also what we can observe here is that there was little to non-archaeological theory influence in terms of processual or post-processual archaeology, unlike Slovenia and Serbia. And we had always and still have very strict divisions of archaeology by time periods, prehistory, antiquity, Middle Ages, and very strict division of realms between most important scholars who are holding their positions. Intense research by Croatian institutions of this period begin only in the 1960s, and they were done mostly by a single researcher, Stojan Dimitrijević, whom I will come back to later when I will talk about the tradition of authority. But first, I will address this tradition of Mitteleuropa, which is very strong. Connections with Austria and Germany, as I said, are mostly regarded as positive. Here you can see the statue of our Viceroy Ban Jelačić, who was the Austrian military official, but is regarded as and is sung of as the national hero because he was fighting Hungarians in the times of Hungarian uprising against the Austrian rule. The strong connections with German-speaking part of the world were constantly enhanced and were especially strong during the war in Croatia and during the collapse of Yugoslavia, where Germany was one of the supporters of Croatian independence. So that we even now have streets named after late German foreign ministers, like street of Hans Dietrich Genscher in present day Vinkovci. Why am I saying this? Because this connections with Germany reflects in each aspect of our society, and German or German background is sort of insurance also of quality. This gentleman here, I guess you all are aware of, from Southern Eastern Europe, Oswald Mengen, the Austrian scholar, the Austrian archaeologist, who, among other things, coined the term Vučedol culture, which is one of the most important and most known of prehistoric cultures in this part of the world. He is the one that gave the name to the Vučedol culture. And in Croatian literature, in Croatian encyclopedia, he is celebrated as the Austrian scholar, but there is no mention of his Nazi background, or it's in encyclopedia only says he moved to Argentina in 1948 without any context as to why he moved to Argentina, which we are all aware of. Another important German person in Croatian prehistory is Robert Rudolph Schmidt, who excavated on several Croatian prehistoric sites, Vučedol being one of them, before and during the Second World War, where he even had war prisoners as laborers at his excavations. But in spite of that all, he is still regarded as Vučedol is regarded as most important site, and he as one of the most important researcher, and his monograph that was published in strange circumstances in 1945 as the most important monograph. As for Robert Rudolph Schmidt, slowly there are some papers that are offering different perspective on this gentleman, as you can see here on this photo, but it is only in recent years. Still, for example, on the web page of my department, he is mentioned in a positive context. I do not have time to read all those parts that I chose from this most important monograph. But for example, it says, no style in prehistory has expressed so many creative forms, especially the talent for drawing, which is dominated feature of Nordic men, as well as the megalithic and Vučedol style. You can see also for yourselves which type of narrative it produced. In 1942, there were several publications in the public journals that pursued the idea that Vučedol was one of the outposts of moving the culture from north of Europe to the south of Europe, and in the end forming Hellenic Greece. But unfortunately, such ideas, not as direct followers, of course, are still present today, where you can find on web page of Museum of Vučedol culture also statements that Vučedol is one of the most important sites who formed European prehistory and European history, also mentioning Robert Rudolph Schmidt in positive contexts. So in 2016, we can still read sentences like this: the Vučedol culture is the highest standard of its time. This is the time when the state and the letter begin in Egypt, Mesopotamia, and China. Europe seems to be on the tree at that time, but it was lucky to have Vučedol culture that was even more advanced in some technological matters. Thus, we can say that the first bronze from the Vučedol era in Vinkovci came to Troy and not the other way around. So slowly, the narrative was formed as the Vučedol as the origin of civilization. Here you have screenshots of some web pages, news web pages, and some portals dealing with history in Croatia, who says Vučedol is the place where we should bow to Indo-European culture, Vučedol, the Troy of Danube. And the third title, the head calendar, they eat of the plates and the sacrifice people. Eating habits is also very important in the narrative of identities of our countries, as I guess colleagues from Serbia will agree with the story of the fork. And we still have the narrative of Schmidt as one of the most important archaeologists. So we have days of Schmidt in Babska that are organized while the archaeological excavations are there. And also we had in news portals after the terrible earthquake in Zagreb last year that the Vučedol Dav is not damaged, but still in that news, there was also mention of Rudolph Schmidt and his role in finding the dove, which is true. Vučedol dove was found during his excavation, and it became one of the important parts of national identity and also the symbol of peace, because Vučedol is situated near Vukovar, who was a city that was almost destroyed during the last war in the 90s. And as such, and being a dove, it formed a strong symbol of peace. It is presented on our money, in our passports. Various craftsmen are doing their products with it. And also we have our boat named, our board on the border named also after Vučedol Dam. The second part of the tradition is authority. Authority is a crucial element in archaeological knowledge production in our country. There is a mutual understanding, agreement, and acceptance between authorities, and one of these agreements is that they do not share their realms, that they have all their separate realms. What is really important to say is that authority is above nation, ideology, and politics, as you will see in the few minutes. Younger generations inherit and continue tradition of authority and hierarchy through formal and informal networks, and the authority is rarely challenged. For example, a few years ago, we did one research of knowledge production in archaeology, and most of our young archaeologists that we spoke to said that interpretation, for example, is the sole right of the project leader, that archaeologists teamwork while collecting the data, but interpretation is the right of the authority. We heard many stories of lonesome geniuses with specific powers, for example, of one that can determine the culture by holding a piece of pottery in hand with his eyes closed. And very important part is also master-apprentice relationship, where apprentice becomes worthy after long and rigorous training, and then he can or she inherit site, chair, or place in the hierarchy. With the authority also comes the sense of entitlement, which we heard of some also yesterday. So we have concepts as my site, my region, my culture, and older generations stick to it because, I guess, of their fear of loss of position, but younger generation also stick to it. Maybe one of the reasons could be fear of losing the solid foundation that this construction offers. One of such authorities was unfortunately unfortunately died in very young age, Stoyan Dimitrievich. He was that lonesome genius with many talents. He was art lover. He had many discoveries. He made periodizations of all Neolithic and Copper Age cultures, and his periodizations are still in use and are very rarely questioned. In his relations to Schmidt, we can see that the concept of authority is above politics and ideology, because even he was, I guess, I can say, had completely opposite political ideas than Schmidt. He had positive attitude towards him because he was the one who made he was the one, sorry, who made important discoveries. Stojan Dimitrijević unfortunately died young, and he became a myth. So we call him exceptional intellectual of 20th century, and we at the conference that was two conferences that was devoted to the 30th anniversary of his death, that we could hear stories and sentences like this, that he was the founder of all archaeology and creator of all chronology, that his colleagues from Europe came with paper and pencil, and that he explained to them how the European prehistory looks like, and that his work is still valid, and new generations inspired by him may continue where his work had untimely stopped. And his work was connected mostly with Neolithic and Copper Age, as I said. And he is the one that formed chronology for Starčevo and Sopot culture here. And Sopot culture, the culture that is something somewhere between Vinča and LBK, became very important part of archaeological identity, and also in current archaeological research, it is still very much appreciated as something that is something that originated right here in our territories. First, it was divided by Milojicic in 1949, but we still didn't researched was this the necessity for discovery of own culture? Was it the necessity to follow grand narratives of origin, of meeting point of borderland, all of those aspects that I was speaking of before? But still, we see Sopot culture as a very important part of this period, this area in prehistory, but we didn't research how it was connected to Vinča culture. We saw it as the outcome of Vinča influence, of Vinča short-term breaches, of Vinča imports, but the other culture that we have in Neolithic, Korenovo culture, we are more inclined to explain as strong genetic connections with LBK. And if I may say, we can say that LBK, Korenovo culture, can be integral part of the West, but in terms of connections of Sopot and Vinča culture, this is the place where the East stopped as many times before in our history. This is also a quote from Dimitrijević, where I think that we can see reflections of such ideas. I will just shortly read one part. To what extent it was merely a cultural pressure, and whether it was possibly even a population diffusion, is difficult to determine specifically, though it was more probably only a cultural pressure, because it is reasonable to assume that even a small population invasion would have integrated this part of the interflow into Vinča cultural sphere. So even today, we can see the persistence of these old interpretations. We can see that ideas of how Neolithic looked in this part of the world persisted even though the new research by aerial photography in the last several years with many publications by my colleagues Kalafatic and Šiljeg show that we have many big enclosure sites during the Neolithic period here. All ideas still persisted. All the interpretations are still very, very much alive. The discovery and originality of authority is still something that is cherished. And all of these make perfect fit with those grand narratives, and it provides the perfect combination for the maintenance of tradition and hierarchy, but also create the image of objectivity. The false image of objectivity, which I think is the rabbit hole that we are constantly falling into. For example, here from my examples, that even though the researcher was Nazi, we can still value his work objectively. If doing proper archaeology, then political context of the time or the researcher is not important, and that knowledge is actually not constructed, but it's there, and it's only to be found by meticulous field work and laboratory analysis. I guess that this is it, and this is the problems that I think we are all facing here. And well, I'm happy to hear your comments and questions, and thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Rajna. Thank you for your very interesting and provocative lecture, and especially for, from my point of view, currently as a moderator, for keeping within time limits. There are many interesting things that we could discuss, and I see already few raised hands. You certainly, if I may, certainly use my position as a moderator, say that you approved the very good title, Tradition of Tradition, and showed us how mutual problems that we have and mutual topics are intertwined in this region from late 19th century and even earlier, in case of Croatia or Slovenia, in archaeology, with modern theoretical approaches. So please, first, I shall be happy to give a word to Jana.
Hi. First of all, Professor Sosic, Klindzic, thank you for this topic you chose and for your presentation, because I think it's you chose the topic which is very, I believe it's very hot in our little community, especially for us younger scholars and younger generations. First of all, Stoyan, yes, I mean, he is the authority. And I'm not saying that he was wrong in everything, but the thing is, yes, no one ever reconsidered anything he has done. No one ever questioned him. I mean, no one, maybe yes, in some private conversations, you know, and everything, but there really is the problem of authority here. And I think when you said that the younger generations stick to the old ways and old traditions, it's not just because of the fear of losing the funding, but we actually do not have any, we don't have much space to implement ourselves, you know, because your generation, for example, is one of the youngest, for example, in our academic circles, in museums, in on the faculty members, in all kinds of institutions. And we don't really see any, in any time that we will be able to contribute really with a job or something like that in the near future. I mean, I don't want to say that you're not good. I mean, your generations, you know, but as there is not much jobs here in Croatia for archaeologists, we can sit at home or we can be in a private sector. When we are in a private sector, there is no much space for us to evolve as scholars or as scientists, because here, mainly, as far as I know, being in a private sector is just excavating and accumulating all the materials, and we just write the reports for the investors, and that's it. No papers, nothing, no interpretations, just, you know, primary reports for the investors, and that's it. We don't have any in our studies, for example. There is no one likes us when we question something.
Yes.
You know, some authority. You all say that you're welcome to have questions, you know, and everything when we were studying, but do not question the authority or the method or something like that, you know. If you understand what I mean.
I'm really grateful for everything that you said. Thank you very much, and for opened another type of problems that I didn't have time to say here. And everything you say it is true. And when I was addressing younger generations, I didn't mean students or people that are working in the private sector and coping with the everyday life while trying to do some research in archaeology, but the people who are already in the system.
Yeah, of course.
The people who are already in the academia.
Yeah.
That decide after a few years that is much easier to just go with the flow.
Yes, of course. And
I really appreciate what you are all doing, younger generations, and I especially appreciate the people who are working in the private sector, providing archaeology with a great amount of data, and many of them are pursuing research in their free time. And I'm really sad that the culture of dialogue is still not present here. And this is one of the reasons that I'm doing this presentation and this work, because without dialogue, we really cannot move on. We can still worship those few persons and write our papers according to their books and their statements.
Yes, exactly.
So thank you, Jana, very much. And everything Jana said are very big problems of Croatian archaeology, where young people are constantly discouraged from involving in any kind of sort of serious dialogues. And I think that you all have very much to contribute.
Yeah, and just one more thing, the problem of going with the flow and everything, I think you can see it right here in this conference, because this conference was, how do you say it? I'm sorry. It was on our faculty webpage.
Yeah.
And I'm the only one, as I can see.
Yes, you are.
You know, the two of us are the only ones attending from Croatia.
Yeah.
And it was a very interesting and very stimulating conference, but you know, no one came. I mean, if you understand what I mean, because it's not that maybe it's not that no one is interested, but the people just don't have enough will, you know, to engage in anything except the things they must during their studies. That's the problem I see in Croatian archaeology and in Croatian educational system, especially. So yeah, that's it.
Thank you, Jana. Rajna, I'm sorry, do you have anything to comment on Jana's question? Comments, please.
Well, as I said, I fully support everything that she said. And she also addressed very big problems in Croatian archaeology that I didn't have time or didn't think of addressing them here. So
Okay.
we have a lot to work on.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.
By the way, excellent photograph of Schmidt, Jankun, and Sievers on Vučedol. We have a similar one with Grbić, Sievers, and Jankun from Vinča, but not as good as that at all.
Yeah, this is from the archives of the Archaeological Museum in Zagreb.
Perfect. Predrag, please.
Yes, I would just maybe help to understand why tradition is so important or so strong in Croatia, in Croatian archaeology. Well, first of all, it has the longest tradition of archaeology in the southeastern Europe. High-quality antiquarians in Croatian Dalmatia and Istria emerged already in the 15th century, and they developed such a tremendous work that can easily match Italy. Really, the Italian antiquarians, Klindzic from Ancona, came to Split and to study Diocletian's palace and to stay in contact. And since then, the scholars from Eastern Adriatic, from Dalmatia, historical province of Dalmatia, were dynamically engaged in development of antiquarian and historical science since then. And the first collections, museums, appeared already at the end of the 18th century. So it was already a very strong intellectual community, which also did not just repeat or just simulate Italian style of archaeological antiquarian science, but also add a lot of local, regional features to it. So this was a very strong tradition from then on. And also another aspect is Croatia had the least breaks. With all these changes of states in the last 150, 200 years, the Croatian archaeology, I would say, had the least breaks. In many other countries, it happened so that archaeology needed to be re-established almost anew after Great War, after the Second World War. There was no people dealing with archaeology. In some countries, archaeology was for the first time established after the Second World War, and so on. Well, with Croatia was always this long tradition, especially tradition which stemmed from the Italian Venetian milieu, which reflected mostly on a Roman period or Roman or late Greek period, with rich finds, with tremendous sites, which were of the famous for the whole world. And this tradition contributed probably to the strong tradition, contributed probably to the respect of tradition in Croatia. It's not the reason, the only reason, but I believe it also is one of the components, because really one can speak of Croatian archaeology in terms of 4 or 5 centuries at least. And it's still a lot to be discovered there. It's still a lot to be discovered from the 17th, 18th centuries. We have a series of local collections in small medieval or Renaissance town along the Adriatic coast, local poets, local historians, and so on. It's a huge, huge tradition. So
yes, yeah, it's true, and also it is very much appreciated our 1,000 years of history in every aspect, and that is true. But also I forgot to mention something at the beginning, that we have also tradition of very strong division between continental and Adriatic part of the country in terms of archaeological research. The border that is only starting to break in the last few years with the more intense cooperation between coastal and continental institutions. Thank you, Predrag.
Thank you. Monica, please.
Thank you, Rajna, for your presentation. I would like to ask you, what would be your solution for Schmidt? So what can we do with dark episodes of history of archaeology? So that's happened, and how would you address that in public sphere, in teaching, at websites, and so on?
I think that we as archaeologists have the opportunity to teach also historical contexts through prehistoric research. And it's something, at least here, that we are not using enough. Until we become, I would say, more grown-up society, I think that his background needs to be put up front. I think that his background at the moment is more important than the discoveries that he made. Some of my students asked me when I was talking to them about Robert Rudolph Schmidt and show him this photo, they were actually quite surprised, and they asked me, so what should we do now? Would it be better if he didn't discover all those great things? And I told them I honestly don't know, because these are the things that we teach in archaeological lectures and handbooks from the very first day we start our education. And we look up to them. And it's like the most important things in prehistoric archaeology here. And I understand that it's not easy for people to accept the fact who the person who discovered it was. It was not easy for me, but it is something that we have to do.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Monica and Rajna. And well, we must put it in their historical context. That's what we have to do, and that's what we do with everything in archaeology, especially in history of archaeological ideas. If their archaeological and historical context was Ahnenerbe, then we should mention that. What I'm more concerned is when Durman says that Europe was on the tree at the time, and with some 19th century discourse in late 20th or 21st century. That's more of more concern to me than what Schmidt did, and we know what he did and where he belonged and who financed the whole thing. But it is all important. It's part of our mutual history of discipline. Now, are there any more comments and questions? This was very, for me, a very important lecture. And please, if there are some other comments and questions, if not, please, now we have another lecture. It's Sasha Babbage from University of Belgrade, Faculty of Philosophy, Department of Archaeology. And she'll tell us about systematizing archaeological practices and knowledges. Please, Sasha.
Thank you. Now the moment of truth, sharing my screen. Okay, sorry. I'm afraid my connection is very poor. So if anything happens during the presentation, I apologize in advance. So just as I said before, it is a good opportunity, and at the same time, it has its limits when you're among the last speakers of the conference. So I will be referring back to some things that we've been discussing over the last 2 days, because they do have to do quite a lot about with what I'm going to speak. So we have gathered here today and yesterday to discuss, as is succinctly written in the invitation for this conference, to discuss why cultural history has such a grip on us. And cultural history, cultural historical paradigm is here described as a way of thinking shared by the belief in the existence of cultural wholes expressed in the archaeological cultures and equated with distinct ethnic entities. Also, its nationalist political agendas are stressed, and its remarkable resilience not only in this part of the world, but also elsewhere. So we are in fact here to discuss why culture history is still such a burden to our discipline, and how do we proceed to processual and post-processual programs of research. So what we are in fact talking about, and I myself am guilty, just like anybody else, we are in fact talking of a kind of a 3H system here, dividing archaeological history into 3 distinct stages, each marked by their own content and their own specific characteristics. So they may be called, and they have been called, paradigms, but just as Monica and other speakers over the last 2 days have mentioned, perhaps this is not the most apt word to describe what we are talking about. And yes, me too, I found a very useful guidance to this question in Gavin Lucas's article from 2016. I'm not sure these are paradigms, and I will be getting back to the point further on. So first of all, we are in fact thinking about this quantum leap in the region. We are thinking about how we are going to jump from the cultural historical tradition that is holding us back to this current state of affairs. If we are following this 3H system idea, then we are in fact, we are obliged to jump somehow from culture history to post-processual and beyond. So what stays behind this pattern is the idea that this is a kind of unilinear evolution. This is the only way that archaeological knowledge can proceed. That is the only way that archaeological knowledge can be accumulated and get growing in any meaningful sense. Perhaps there are different paths, and perhaps we should discuss these paths. Perhaps we should think about some other branches of this unilinear tree. And perhaps a good way to start is to think about these packages, culture, historical, processual, and post-processual, as not being so fully coherent as we usually simplify their content. So let's start by culture historical. When we talk about culture history, there is always that skeleton in our cupboard called Gustav Kosina, and the fact that he was in fact very mightily abusing archaeological past to some other ends. So when we are talking about culture history, we do mention Kosina, and we do mention the fact that there are very severe possibilities of abuse of culture history, just like the announcement to this conference did stress. But at the same time, the person that is usually accredited with formulating the very basic concept of culture history, cultural group, is of course Child. So Child is also very deeply inscribed into our idea about cultural historical archaeology. And we do mention, and we always start by citing to our students his definition of cultural groups, but we very rarely mention the fact that Child, especially in some years of his career, was very deeply involved into Marxist thought. And quite a lot of what he did was in fact inspired by his Marxist philosophy approaches. So there is a very strong strain of that in culture history, which somehow seems to be omitted. Of course, this is one of many examples. I want to pay your attention. I want to bring your attention to the fact that culture history is not such a unified package as we usually think. We of course know that, but we very often conveniently gloss over these differences and these shades of gray that are between Child and Kosina. The same can be said about processional archaeology. Processional archaeology is usually thought of, and the first idea that comes to our minds is Louis Bimford and his middle range theory. And that is where we start by explaining to our students what processional archaeology is. The other hero of this huge upheaval in the 60s was, of course, David Clark. He died young, just like Stoyan Dimitrievich, so he didn't have time to develop his own thought. And I keep thinking about the fact, how would, in fact, processional archaeology or any kind of archaeology look like in 70s and 80s if David Clark was the leading star of this movement and not Lou Bimford? So when we talk about processional archaeology, do we limit ourselves only to what Louis Binford was doing and his successors, or perhaps we should go back to David Clark a little bit more? And finally, when we are speaking about processional archaeology, do we think perhaps about Will Ratje and what he was doing in his Babić project, which is in fact very much echoed in what Rado was talking about today, the archaeology of the present. So a very vibrant new field of archaeology developed from his workings, which are broadly speaking also processual. Another point which is very important here is that although we have been talking about processual archaeology as a drastic change in archaeological thinking, let me underline once more that processional archaeology has never challenged the concept of cultural group. So we should think about it very hardly. It has never been challenged by processional archaeology. It was up to some later writers to think about it in another way, to bring our attention to the fact that this concept has some limits. So when we talk about post-processional archaeology, do we think about Ian Hodder's Symbols in Action, or perhaps Shanks and Tilley's early works, or we think about Christopher Tilley's later works, Metaphor and Material Culture, that again have some other ideas and some other possible ways of developing upon them than early Hodder's works. So even post-processional archaeology, that is by the own admission of the people working or identifying themselves with this strain of archaeological thought, that it is very varied, that it is interpretive, in fact, not only one strain, but many strains and many influences. And of course, that is the case. Post-processional archaeology can hardly be taken as one coherent program and as one coherent paradigm, if we want to use that word. So this is what we came from. This is what was going on. And what is next? So if we are to catch up, if we are to somehow jump from culture history to the present state, what is the present state? What is the present state of archaeological theory that we aspire to? Is it perhaps what was described in Harris and Sipola's book, Archaeological Theory in the New Millennium? Is it what Olsen is talking about when he's talking about the need to defend objects, to defend things? Is it perhaps what Ian Hodder is trying to articulate in his latest book, Entangled? So these are all are things that are more or less somehow similar, but at the other end of the spectrum, there is Christiansen talking about a new paradigm very explicitly, talking about the third science revolution. So where are we headed? What is the next big thing that we want to catch up with? And here I do agree with Predrag that we probably have to be very flexible about what is going to happen and where, in fact, we are aiming at. Of course, it brings up the question, who sets the epistemic norms? All the authors that I was mentioning until now come from another part of the world, not from the part of the world that these participants of this conference are from. So there is a very interesting interplay between local and global, the East and West, and us standing here as the rest. Of course, I'm referring to Maria Todorova, and I'm sure that to this particular assembly of people, I don't really have to explain what I think about, what I think of when I mention Maria Todorova. So the epistemic norms are set globally, or are supposed to be set globally, and then we locally react to them. What Alec was talking about yesterday is the difference between our academic environments and the environments in the metropolis, where the epistemic norms usually are thought to be made, thought to be agreed upon. So it brings us into a very perplexing situation. Are we going to catch up? Are we trying to catch up? Are we trying to somehow, in great speed, rush through all these stages because we are in some kind of arrested development in culture history. So we are going to speed up through processional archaeology, reach post-processional, and then decide what's going on. Are we going to ontologically turn ourselves, or we are going to put all our efforts into third science revolution? So what, in fact, is our goal here? Do we accelerate? And do we, in this acceleration, can we, in fact, follow that rapid pace without serious damage for what we are doing? Is this, in fact, the task of the whole communities? Do all the archaeologists of a single community should devote themselves to this catching up, or collectives, just like Monica described them in Fleckian terms? Is it some parts of these communities that are supposed to do these tasks? Or perhaps individuals? Whose task is this? And how we are going to make this work? How are we going to implement this acceleration results into a workable strategy of doing archaeology in particular region, in particular country? So I tried to put this whole bunch of questions into a very particular, very concrete example, the one that I know best, which is myself. So in fact, how do we survive this paradigm shifting? How do we get around these things, these obstacles that keep presenting themselves in front of archaeologists from the regions that are not at the peak of theoretical thought in archaeology? What do we do about it? So this is a very short example from my own professional career. Some of the people present here have already read some of it that I wrote in Serbian, of course. So it is another issue that we keep, quite a lot of our writing is limited to a very small audience of readers that can read our languages. While doing it, in fact, I'm referring back to what Pierre Bourdieu described as the exercise of historizing the subject of historization, or else to objectify the subject of objectification. So I'm not trying to present to you an anecdote, a series of anecdotes from my life. I'm trying to, in fact, illustrate how a particular researcher goes through these changes and through these challenges of developing one's theoretical background, one's theoretical stance when coming from a country such as Serbia without quite a lot of infrastructure supporting our theoretical development. So this is one auto-reflexive exercise. And just like Bourdieu said, it, of course, has to deal with both individual, collective, and disciplinary levels. So it's like Russian dolls. It's all intertwined, because I have been situated in a certain particular situation from which I have been doing archaeology and thinking about it. And of course, this also refers not only to my immediate professional community, but also to the wider situation in the country, in the society I live in. So what may be a good example is the book published in 2003. It was in fact written in 1998. It is my doctoral thesis. Its title is Poglavarstvo I polis, in English, Chiefdom and Polis. So it was in fact done as a doctoral thesis and defended, completed in 98. Of course, it was written at least several years before that. It was quite a long thing in the making. The starting point for my research was the book by Peter Wells, Culture Contact and Culture Change. I even borrowed his title for the subtitle of my thesis and subsequent book. So I started by referring to Peter Wells, which was published in 1980. Of course, quite an important book for me was Center and Periphery in the Ancient World, which was published in 1997. So one may say that it was a very straightforward line from 1980 to 1998 or 2003 when the book was finally published. So it was straightforward. I was drinking on the sources of Peter Wells and Rowlands and Christiansen, and I was then pouring that into my doctoral thesis. Some 20 years later, I was badly lagging behind. I was trying to do, by the end of the 20th century, what people in archaeology in other parts of the world were doing 20 or 30 years before. I was introducing some kind of processual paradigm into the research. Of course, it is a very easy way of putting it. I was late. I was late because I was the member of an academic community, of an archaeological academic community that was late, that was not catching up in the adequate way with what was going on in the West or in archaeological theory in general. So what was going on, in fact, while I was writing my thesis? 19th in Serbia. 19th, of course, in Serbia can't be limited only to Serbia because things were spilling all over the place. And quite a lot of pictures from this period can be disturbing to, they are disturbing for me, and I'm sure that they are disturbing to anybody who was in any way involved or lived through the 90s in the region. The dissolution of Yugoslavia, the wars, the atrocities and maimed and killed people all around the place. Quite a lot of things were going on in Belgrade, street protests and tanks in the street. So it was a very tense and a very devastating experience of living in the region in the 90s. So these were the years when I was trying to think about Iron Age in the Balkans. And these were the days when I was trying to finish my PhD thesis, quite often thinking, why the hell am I doing this while people are getting killed? So this sorry decade came to an end in 1999 by the international intervention in Serbia, and then in the year 2000 by the so-called Little October Revolution, the fall of the regime of Slobodan Milošević. Little did we know that it will not change things permanently for good, but nevertheless, we were very happy and very hopeful and very optimistic when that happened. Throughout this period, I was myself and Alexander Palavestra here present too. We were trying to find our own way of doing things, spending days and days in the streets, protesting, being parts of peace movements and all kinds of opposition gatherings and protests in the streets of Belgrade that were very often heralded by the sign, Belgrade is the world, Beograd je svet. We wished to get back to the world, to be part of the world. So this is where I was standing while writing my dissertation, in the middle of all this chaos, and drinking from the sources of Wells, Frankenstein, and Rowlands, and getting ideas from the books that were already 20 years old. Of course, in the background of their ideas is Wallerstein's world system model, and furthermore, Brodel, Marx, and Polanyi, of course, are all intertwined in this idea that I was buying. Binford was there, of course. Alexander Palavestra, who was doing things in on similar archaeological material, was a very important cornerstone for my research. Of course, there are other people that stand behind Garashanin, Srejović, and Vasić, which are the forefathers of our tradition. But at the same time, I was reading Shanks, Tilly, and Miller. I started reading some other books, and some other ideas started seeping into my research. I was, of course, very much in contact with Predrag Novaković, who opened up a little bit of the window for us, especially when he invited us in 1994 for the conference in Ljubljana. So the Belgrade archaeologists had the opportunity to mingle with another parts of the world. So that straight line that was drawn beforehand, in fact, doesn't look like that. It looks like this. I was in the middle of a whole entangled relationships between different authors, their mutual relationships, and that is how, in fact, my worldview was created. I was not simply following one straight line. It was many lines that were intersecting in many ways and, of course, confusing each other. But I can't really honestly say this was a processual book. It was a processual book that did quite a lot about Bourdieu and Foucault and was inspired by Shanks and Tilly. So what is, where do we put that book if we want to be very pedantic about paradigmatic sorting of archaeological work? So transfers of knowledge, in fact, are not so neat and do not represent one very straight line from one head to another. They are not ready-made packages delivered to our doorstep. They are more or less a very unruly storage of ideas, wherefrom we pick and choose in all kinds of ways, in all kinds of decisions that we make in these processes. And in these processes, we somehow create the epistemic norms. So we again have to wonder whether it is an uncontested unity that we aspire to. Do we want to make it a kind of a very unified epistemic field of archaeology where a very ironclad rules flatten down the landscape that we are moving, or perhaps we can be methodological omnivores, as put by Adrian Curry, philosopher of science. And here I want to point one more very short note, that those transfers of knowledge can, of course, operate in many different directions. They operate generationally, and they operate generationally in both directions. So it was Monika Milosavljević who brought to my attention this idea and many other ideas. So it is also that apprentice-master relationship can be subverted and can sometimes work both ways. Also, I get back to the ideas of Chapman Wiley and Gavin Lucas. We are in fact obliged to think about our record. We are obliged to think about our evidence and what our discipline is founded upon, what we in fact have as the source of the knowledge that we produce, and what are those qualities, what are its limitations, and what are the possibilities for gaining knowledge on the grounds of this particular kind of record, this particular kind of evidence. And another thing is that Gavin Lucas was very persuasive for me when saying that the ideas about our sources are in fact very much unified all throughout the history of archaeology, regardless of the fact that we can label particular authors as processual, post-processual, or cultural historical. In fact, some basic ideas about archaeological record are present all throughout the development of our discipline, and perhaps we should rethink them first. Also, and this is again very much in accordance with what Predrag was talking, we have to think about the relationship between our theoretical concerns and the practical application of what we are doing, the practical consequences of our theoretical thinking, because that is the only way for a discipline, for any discipline, archaeology included, to in any way progress. And finally, no, I'll skip this one. I know, Sasha, I am finishing. I will skip this one for the sake of briefness, and in fact say that we should think more about the ways in producing useful knowledge than producing a science that is very neat in terms of its epistemic norms being very explicit and very clear-cut and cut in stone. And for the end, I would like to share with you one quotation that was very inspiring for me. The question is not, therefore, whether a theory is grand or small, or whether it is universal, global, or particular, local, but what function a theory plays and whose interests it serves. I think that is the basic question that we have to answer. And for the very last, my favorite citation from one Indian author: paradoxical and cynical as it may sound, what makes the world thinkable as one in all its relationality is the symptomatic richness of the term unevenness. We don't really have to be even all around the place. We should better think about the ways of enriching in multiple solutions that we can devise. Thank you. Sorry for being a bit too long.
Exit. No, you were just in time. Thank you very much, Staša.
Thank you.
Obviously, I can't comment very much because I'm in many ways within this presentation and this discourse. I could only add that, however, if you and some of us were badly behind the theoretical trends in what we call West for 10 or 20 years, still we were accused of being trendsetters for new fashion trends in archaeology and not regarded that well among many traditional archaeologists in our midst. Well, I'd just like to open the discussion. Rajna is first who raised her hand, so please, Rajna, proceed.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Staša. Your presentations are always great and very useful to me. And as you were saying about other people, you are the one. You are one of the people that well influenced me very much when I started to do archaeology. I'm
extremely glad if that's true.
Yes.
to have contributed to presentations such as the one before mine, in a way.
Thanks. Well, what I would like to ask you, I wrote down many questions, but I cannot monopolize this, so I think I will ask only two. The last thing that you mentioned about the production of knowledge and science, how do you think that we should deal with this in this area, in this age of pseudoscience that we see in each level of our society, very dangerous ones, and as we can see with the anti-vaxxer movement, because it's something that I have trouble with very much. As an archaeologist, I'm really afraid of this neo-positivism, what is doing to our discipline and what kind of consequences it may have, especially genetic ones.
Yeah.
But on the other hand, it's really not easy not to sound or not to contribute to the pseudoscience anti-vaxxer movements if we question the validity of objective scientific research.
Yes.
If you understood what I want to say.
Absolutely, I understand. That's $1 million question that our Belgrade Thought Collective has been discussing for weeks on. That is really a very severe question, and I don't really have a ready-made answer. We've just had 2 weeks ago, we've had a similar conversation on one Zoom conference, haven't we, Monica and Sasha? What I think is important, as opposed to, and I think that especially Sasha will back me up on this one. What is important, as opposed to pseudoscience, we are obliged to open up our toolkit. We are obliged to explain how we got to the knowledge that we are presenting. And we have the responsibility not only to produce the final result that can be so spectacular, but also to explain the ways in which our inferences were built upon, were constructed. And I'm not using the word constructed in a bad sense here.
Yeah, I understand.
Were built, if you wish.
Yes, yes.
To avoid that overtone that may be confusing. So how do we build our inferences? We have to present it to the public along with the inferences themselves. And then we are, I hope, a little bit more shielded from this particular jeopardy, which is very severe. And I agree with you that if we play by the tune that we don't really have to be scientific in terms of positivistic, then we can fall prey to these pseudoscientific tendencies. That is really so. But that goes not only for archaeology, that goes, as we have seen and you've just mentioned, for medicine, for all kinds of sciences that are usually thought of as a much more solid kind of knowledge than archaeological knowledge. We've seen, and Fleck has explained to us, that it doesn't really have to be so.
Yes.
But nevertheless, in public opinion, archaeology can be storytelling, and medicine is very hard science. So even they fall prey to this particular problem, which is a problem of the moment that we live in, I think. And the only way to counteract is, in fact, to say, people, this is how we do, this is how we operate, this is how we make claims that we make, this is what my stance is grounded in, this is how I got to the conclusion on the grounds of this and this and that. And of course, some of it can be disproved in the future, as usually is and has to be. But for the time being, this is the best possible solution that I have to offer, because I can back it up in these and these particular scaffoldings, as Wiley and Chapman put it. So I think that we at the same time have to offer the knowledge, the storytelling archaeological, if you wish, and the way in which we built it, the way in which we reached upon the conclusions that we offer to the public, if we are talking about our presentation to the public. And that is why I'm so very adamant about archaeology of the present. That is one of the reasons that I think it is so important, because at the same time, we can open up that camera obscura that we keep hiding from the public and mystifying the knowledge that we are building. If we don't mystify it, if we make it approachable, then it will be, first of all, more appealing and much more convincing.
Yes, and we will leave much less space to others to form all kinds of crazy theories. Thank you very much. I hope we will make it work, all of us. And another question concerning David Clark. You said that you were asking yourselves what would archaeology look like if he didn't die such young. I'm also asking myself that. But what I want to ask you, why do you think that nobody pursued his ideas about the archaeology as a very immature discipline? Because I think that it was maybe his biggest contribution that was spread through his text, that archaeology still, when he was writing that in 70s, decades from forming some sort of valid, strict methodology, and that it's something that we have to work on. And I think that it really disappeared from archaeological discourse, that we all approach archaeology as very strict and formed discipline. And I think maybe that is one of the big problems why we are facing all these things that we were talking about for the last few days. So why do you think that nobody else pursued this idea to such an extent?
I don't know, probably it's not a very posh thing to be a member of a community that is not so mature. Probably that's the reason. And also, I think that it is a good example of an individual's posture making an impression on academic community. It is very hard to not to say that Louis Binford was a very imposing character and a very imposing figure, whereas Clark died young and was not obviously a very imposing figure in that particular sense. So simply, it somehow is that Binford occupied the whole field of early processional archaeology. And I myself, and Predrag corrected me when I was writing my book, I was leaning heavily upon Binford. And then one day Predrag said, okay, where the hell is Clark over here? And he was completely right.
Yeah.
Because Clark simply somehow slips out of our attention. And I think it's a pity. We should get back to Clark, I think, a bit more.
Okay, thank you, Staša.
Thank you, Rajna and Staša. And I agree. We have to be explicit in our theory and method, and that's our arms and shield against the pseudoscience and nothing else. Please, now, Yorgos, please.
Thank you, and thank you for this really thought-provoking presentation. I would like to contribute with a comment along the same lines from a slightly different point of view. Well, from where I come from, I can see that culture groups were challenged by processional archaeology. As I mentioned in my presentation, Colin Renfrew devoted half of his book tearing the culture historical sequence of the Cyclades apart and in pieces. Perhaps his mistake was to retain the word culture, probably because he wanted to engage with previous discourse. But his own cultures were like one Cycladic island to the north and the other right down to the south, just to show the oxymoron of retaining the term culture. But I certainly agree with you that what, to my mind, processionalists didn't challenge as much was empiricism, was the idea that the archaeological remains are reliable enough and we can decipher the past out of them in a rather straightforward manner. For traditional archaeology, this was identity. For processional archaeology, this was a type of social organization. And in this sense, I very much agree with you that this is a problem that runs through both these these paradigms. At the same time, and this brings me to the second, let's say, part of my comment. It's true that I mean, archaeologists, we have our each of our feet in on a different boat. We study the past material culture. This defines us, but want to say something about the people of the past, and this defines us as well. And I think different paradigms try to, to balance. Some of them, others try to place more emphasis on the material record, and others on the people behind the material record. To my mind, we should place more emphasis on understanding the people, but that's a personal, let's say, preference or style.
I agree. I'm also much more interested in people than in things as themselves. But as a matter of fact, in the interplay between people and things, and that is what I think is our main task. And for the sake of my young colleague Monica, for the interplay of people, animals, and things. Okay. Speaking about Colin Renfrew and processional challenging of cultural group, it is not that they didn't challenge the results of the archaeological investigation based upon cultural groups. The concept of cultural group, what it in fact, what it's laid upon, wasn't challenged. The very idea that is behind it wasn't challenged. It was just translated into some other ideas and some other labels, if you wish. So we got complexes, socioeconomic complex and so on. We didn't have cultural groups, but the very basic concept linking material culture to human behavior was in fact intact. And that's what I'm referring to. But it is a very long discussion, perhaps not really for this time of the day.
Thank you. Just for the record, Binford did criticize Clark for not doing away with cultural groups. So much. But please, Diana.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Staša, for this very fascinating talk and this fascinating combination between ego history, intellectual history, history of science. That was really nice. Thank you. I would like to address the question you asked in the second half of your talk. What's next? In more general terms, of course. Again, as someone who is outsider to this community. You said that one possible strategy might be catching up. Another would be going through the same stages, through the same theories that had already been tested elsewhere, and something else, maybe something third or fourth, I forgot. I wonder whether this could be of some use, but what occurred to me at this point was Alexander Gerschenkron's idea of the advantages of backwardness. Now, Alexander Gerschenkron, at the beginning of the 20th century, he was an economist, an economic historian, and was dealing with issues of backwardness and catching up. And he came up with the solution on the basis of empirical studies, for example, comparing Russia and Germany and how these two societies try to cope with backwardness. He said that there is no chance for a catching up society to repeat the stages of the pioneer societies, of the vanguard societies. For one thing, because there is no time for it. I mean, the vanguard society do not wait for us to catch up with them. So we are always doomed to be catching up with them if we try to repeat their stages. So the only winning strategy we can possibly have is to utilize the most vanguard, the state of the art, whatever that may be at any given point, and to be part of the vanguard of the state of the art means to be co-creative in making it. And I like your metaphor with these various packages, where also your own tradition, which you could critically re-examine, is partaking. And I think that if there is anything we as one of those marginal parts of the world can catch up with the vanguards, with the pioneers in the discipline, is precisely to step on the local traditions. Absolutely. And to rethink the local traditions in a way unexpected, unforeseen, and so.
Absolutely.
It's a very general observation, of course.
Yes, that is a very good reading of what I had in mind. Of course, I was just piling up questions in order to show, in order to try and demonstrate that it is impossible. We can't really kind of accelerate this perceived unilinear evolution of archaeological paradigms, for the lack of the better word, and in order to get to where everybody else is already. First of all, not everybody else is there already, first of all. And secondly, it is like Alice in Wonderland. We are running in order to stay in place. Of course, that is not the good strategy. And it is also not doing, it doesn't give us the chance to harness our own experiences, which can be valuable on the global scale. And this is why I finished by that Radhakrishnan citation, because, quote, because I think that not being even all around the place is always an asset, and that particularities of our own historical experiences and our own particular intellectual traditions, if we are able to articulate them in a way to be understood globally, can be a very important asset for the discipline or the disciplines in general, not only archaeology, but also your discipline, history or literary theory or any other humanity. Our own particular intellectual traditions from small regions can be enriching for the disciplines in general, but we have to learn how to articulate them. We have to learn how to present them in an intelligible way to be able to communicate with the mainstream, if we want to name it that way. Yes, but you are completely right. That is precisely what I had in mind, and thank you for bringing it up so eloquently. I believe that Predrag's hand is raised and Sasha is muted.
Thank you. I'll give a Predrag. I just wanted to say that running to stay in place in evolution is the good strategy. It's the only way.
Okay then, sorry.
But
well, that comes when you mix. That is what happens when you mix metaphors.
metaphors, yes.
Sorry.
Brother, please.
I would like to address a few things that deal also with the question of Rajna and with what was raised lastly. I'm not so much worried about pseudo-archaeological attempts. They are a domain which, of course, needs special attention, but for me, major problem is, or a greater problem is bad archaeology, which is also part of our history. And answer how to fight bad archaeology or aberrations in archaeology could be quite frequently, or in most cases, found in the history of the discipline, in the history how archaeology coped with similar or analogous situations in the past, even in the, let's say, periods when archaeology in one community or one country was mostly abused or was monopolized by one type of discourse, there were always critiques from the same community. The very Cosina, we are quoting him very frequently these 2 days, received the most harsh critique by a German, Ernst Wahler, in 41 and 42 published. So during the Second World War, another German published a severe critique of Cosina, and of course showing how the Cosina's methodology, who was already dead for some 8 years at that time, is wrong. And upon this critique, they could build, let's say, renewal of a German prehistoric archaeology afterwards. So also, I know, there are plenty of cases how in a history of discipline, we can find good answers to questions which reappear in a bit different form later. I don't want to quote the case of Zimbabwe and how group of female archaeologists subverted that idea of archaeology or interpretation of Zimbabwe as post-Phoenician, sort of a European phenomenon, not allowing local cultures to be developed enough to build something like Great Zimbabwe and so on. So it's the the meticulous research of history of science or archaeology in our case can really help us a lot in facing the modern challenges. The modern genetic studies, not by archaeologists only, but, or better to say, the way how the results of some genetic studies, which may not really be, how to say, very representative, are frequently used in very quick ad hoc interpretations that has not much to do with archaeology or are completely wrong or dismiss any archaeological knowledge. We were in the similar situation maybe 80, 90 years ago when Sasha brought his brachycephalization, when this kind of anthropometry dominated the physical anthropology, which wanted to enter the space of history or early history in, let's say, the Balkans. Albanians was at that time probably the most visited nation by German physical anthropologists, measuring skulls and other, wanting to, let's say, research something they believed was a cultural fossil in Europe at that time. So we can learn a lot how this was spread. I'm talking about academic community, not the public, the layman public. And also this can be looked how and why the term culture and cultural history had so deep roots in this area. The fact is that this kind of approach developed in an environment which experienced a highly dynamic, complex geographical, political, religious history where competition was, for most of the history, part of the everyday worldview rather than cooperation. Cooperation on international level is something that's really recent in international politics, and it's competition that dominated the worldviews. And of course, it's logical that you look for the competition also in the past, actually use the past competition for getting advantage in recent competitions. And of course, if you look in history, you see that the term culture, where it developed, how it developed in German Kultur, let's say, there are good analysis how this concept of culture was something that was parallel to, let's say, French concept of civilization with different meaning. They have different geographies, different anthropogeographies, for example, French and German schools. And, well, German scholarship had a lot of mechanisms to be present in much of the Central and Eastern Europe, not only because much of this territory was part of once Holy Empire, and later also German and Austrian empires, but also they developed centers of knowledge, centers of excellence much earlier than, let's say, the rest of great deals of the rest of Europe, especially those parts of Europe which were for centuries under the Ottoman rule, which had a different concept of intellectual development. So this is why I believe we need to go to research the history to find, I wouldn't say direct answers, but to find inspiration how to answer the challenges of the future. Anyway, archaeology is something that's, I don't know, at least 200-300 years old, practiced in this period by probably 1 or 2 million people maybe in Europe, one way or another, and there's much to be learned from their experiences and what they left behind. And just to finish with this idea of how to contribute to world development of archaeological theory from the margins. Well, marginal position can be also not just to add a new spice to a big broth or to a big dish, but also we have or had, all of us, lived in a particular conditions in our countries, in particular parts of history. And it is this experience which can not only enrich, but which can provide good insights into many, many problems that, let's say, global or those theoretical centers may face in the future. Just to finish with one case, the debate in the last, now it's not that much developed, but the debate on what is European heritage. That was debate promoted by EU Commission, many bodies, and of course, those, I would say, interesting is enough how this debate developed. It developed first in a rather exclusive way. We should define what is Europe and what is heritage, and then to look for the common denominators. Then, of course, there was a severe criticism of exclusivism of this and so on, or some sort of Europocentric view on heritage and so on. But the similar debate, not on the same scale, we had in Yugoslavia in the late 80s. What is Yugoslav archaeology and what is Yugoslav archaeological heritage? And this debate showed different answers, different things. The same question was repeated on a different level or in 2000s. And of course, no one of those who contributed to this panel had any experiences of, so to say, multinational, multi-ethnic, multi-religious, if you want, living personal experiences of living in such context than us who were there. And we can say, look, this is not a new question for us. It's something that we have debated 30 years ago. We may not have reached the perfect conclusions, but we have debated. So learn from these cases. And then when you put all these smaller, I wouldn't say peripheries, you can learn a lot from them, even for the so-called big centers.
Yes. Thank you, Predrag. We are running a little bit late. I wonder if Staša has anything to add, but
just one, just like Predrag said, there are lots of experiences lived in the places outside the metropolis, if you want. We want to choose that post-colonial theory term. For example, we have been communicated, and I'm getting back to the example I mentioned yesterday. We have all been communicating for 2 days now in English, none of us being a native speaker. But in order to exercise our academic life, we have to speak English, and we all translate in our heads from Serbian, Bulgarian, Slovenian, Greek, Turkish, whatnot. And that is not the experience of British archaeologists. In order to practice their discipline, they can do it safely in their own language. We have to do it in another language. And that's one of the many experiences we have, which enable us to think in different ways, in a more kind of multiple way about what we are dealing with. And that's what I think we can bring to the table. Not only, of course, language is just again a silly example, but we can bring to the table the multiplicity of our lived experiences and traditions, rather than trying blindly to catch up with what's going on in the metropolis.
If I may say so, I'm pretty sure British archaeologists need to translate in their heads our English to their own.
That may be true. That may be true.
Or rather, there was even a better suggestion that native English speakers from the academia should be taxed, that they should pay a tax for publishing in their native language. Yeah.
That's true. Also.
Okay. Do you think that a 15 minutes break will be enough so that we catch up again just for the last presentation and then for rounding up our discussion? Would that be fine with you?
In 15 minutes.
15 minutes, yes. Quarter past 3, 4, respectively.
Yes.
Thank you, Alexander. Thank you, Staša, once again.
Thank you.
See you in a while. See you in a while.
From National and Kapodistrian University of Athens. He'll tell us about regional surface survey as a step forward, some thoughts, and share some thoughts on the basis of the Greek case study. Yiannis, please.
Can you see my screen? Can you hear me?
Yes, yes, okay. yes, we can see it.
Okay. Thank you very much, Alexander. Thank you very much. I would like to thank you, the organizers, for inviting me. And since I'm the last, I'll try to be as fast as possible. I think that over the last 2 days, everybody agreed about the resilience of the cultural historical paradigm and empiricism in our countries, despite the clear efforts towards processual, post-processual, or even post-humanistic approaches over the last 20, 30 years. However, I think that Greece is a somewhat different case study because due to the early appropriation of Greek classical antiquity by the West, it became an archaeological laboratory for the application of different trends in archaeological theory and practice by Western archaeologists. It is the traditional plus, with emphasis on the word plus, that Yorgos presented yesterday. And I think that a good example of this plus can be seen in the application of intensive landscape archaeological surveys, an archaeological method that developed in the 1960s in parallel with the emergence of new archaeology and the awakening of the cultural historical thinking in Western academia. What I would like to present today is a retrospective view of regional surface surveys in Greece in an effort to study the impact of these research projects on national archaeology, examine the diffusion of the relevant theoretical trends, and assess the degree to which they turned the theoretical agenda of Greek archaeology away from the cultural historical thinking. Archaeological landscape research in Greece has a deep history going back to the first travelers of the Renaissance and the Enlightenment. Greece was one of the most prominent and important destinations of the Grand Tour during the 17th and 18th century. In the 19th century, some of these early attempts became proper scientific expeditions aiming at recording in the highest possible detail antiquities scattered across the Greek landscape. In Greece, archaeological topography became one of the main elements of some sort of colonial cartography, with maps giving special emphasis on antiquities next to other sources of information, useful for creating colonial-type relationships. Such maps supported not only claims for political control or influence, but also the appropriation of the Greek past by the Westerners. Paradoxically, the interest on topography and archaeological landscape faded away in the late 19th century and the first half of the 20th century during the domination of cultural historical paradigm. Maps of this period were used to illustrate material culture distributions and consequently the presence of certain cultural groups across large regions. In Greece, although most of this work was carried out by foreign non-Greek scholars, it served the needs of the national narrative about historical continuity from ancient to modern times. For prehistoric phases, the distribution of material culture across the landscape was used in order to identify pre-Greek cultures and people, and even more to identify the arrival and the origins of the first Greeks. For the later historical periods, the most important aim was to identify sites recorded in ancient written sources and compare the archaeological evidence with these sources. Such approaches provided a convenient scientific way for the appropriation of the Greek past by both the Western academic discourse, but also by the Greek academic discourse. Concerning landscape archaeological fieldwork, this period is characterized by extensive non-systematic surveys aiming at creating gazetteers of sites. Because of their methodology, these extensive surveys were able to identify only large sites, mostly settlements sitting in prominent locations in the landscape, rather than produce a comprehensive pattern of human habitation over a large area. The interpretation of settlement patterns was based on deterministic factors, but still without systematic recording of environmental and landscape characteristics. This old tradition of archaeological landscape research did not have any impact to the Greek archaeological tradition as practiced by Greek universities and the Greek Archaeological Service. No systematic surface or topographical surveys were carried out, and the focus of interest was exclusively on the excavation of large important sites. After all, with so many sites to excavate and protect, topographical studies were considered a luxury. Furthermore, these gazetteers were often considered by the Greek Archaeological Service as a possible threat for the archaeological sites, which could be easily targeted by potential looters, both Greeks and foreigners. The big shift in the tradition of the extensive regional surveys came in the 1970s as part of the processional shift. Before this, however, I would like to mention a special case, also mentioned briefly by Yorgos yesterday. It is the Minnesota Messini expedition by MacDonald and Rapp under the auspices of the American School of Classical Studies, which started in the late 50s and continued in most part of the 60s. It is considered as the culmination of the long tradition of extensive regional studies because it still followed the extensive methods of surveying, but on the other hand, it offered new approaches to the study and understanding of the diachronic relationship between humans and landscape. The research questions included demography, settlement patterns, economic exploitation, subsistence, and social and political organization. In other words, despite its methodology of extensive surveying, it was very much processual in terms of the research questions, a decade before the establishment of regional intensive surveys of the processual approach. I think this survey reinforces the idea expressed in the beginning that Greece functions as a laboratory for the application of recent trends in archaeological theory and practice by foreign archaeologists. The real paradigmatic shift in terms of both survey methods and research questions came in the 70s with the so-called New Wave surveys. Now we're dealing with relatively small scale intensive surveys, investigating long historical processes and cultural chains within an ecodeterministic approach and with an intensive method of survey. Research questions concerning the origin of civilization or the distribution of material culture were replaced by new ones concerning the emergence and development of state societies, the sociopolitical organization of city-states, and the economic exploitation of landscape. Few things changed in the following decades. In the 80s, special emphasis was given to settlement patterns, site hierarchies, and land use, while in the 90s, we see real interdisciplinary projects and the application of large-scale geoarchaeological approaches aiming at reconstructing the past environment. What is also observed in the 90s is that the initial optimism, typical of the early stages of processual archaeology, was succeeded by an emerging awareness of the limitations of surveying methodology. Can we make inferences from surface assemblages? Which is the impact of post-depositional processes? How do we identify sites and what actually is a site? And it is interesting to note that this awareness came from within the processional tradition rather than from criticism by the emerging post-processual thinking. Interdisciplinary approaches reduced but by no means eliminated the problem. Siteless or non-site-oriented surveys started also to develop in order to overcome the site-off-site problem. Nevertheless, the validity of regional surface surveys was never denied, but it was considered as one of several other methods of archaeological investigation. The large number of surface surveys in the 70s and 80s suggests once more that during these decades, Greece, alongside with Italy, became a laboratory for the application of these new methods of landscape archaeological survey. For this reason, we fully accept the title of this seminal book by Van Andel and Ranels, that archaeologists working in Greece were able for the first time to go beyond the Acropolis, not only by focusing on Greek rural landscape instead of cities, but also by studying all periods of the Greek past, even contemporary past, not just the glorious classical phases. But what about Greek archaeology? Had these landscape archaeological projects any impact on national archaeology? Did they turn the theoretical agenda of Greek archaeology away from the cultural historical thinking? I am afraid the answer is no. All the surface surveys of the 70s and the 80s were planned and conducted by foreign scholars and foreign universities. Just to mention a few, Agiopharagos, Southeast Argolid, Laconia, Methana, Milos, Boeotia, Kea, Nemea, Pylos, Lasithi, Gournia, Messara, all of them are by foreign schools. For the Greek Archaeological Academia, archaeological fieldwork consisted exclusively of excavations. Despite the increase in the number of departments and professors of archaeology, intensive landscape surveys were not part of the Greek archaeological curricula. The pledge for a systematic study of diachronic occupation in rural Greece did not attract the interest of Greek archaeology in the 70s and 80s. As shown yesterday again by Yorgos, I think the reason behind this neglect is that the influence of new archaeology on Greek archaeology remained minimal. In Greece, archaeological discussions that are closer to the cultural historical approach were more easily absorbed, at least until the end of the 90s. As in the previous periods, with so many sites to excavate, systematic, intensive landscape studies were considered as a luxury. But I think there are some additional factors for Greek archaeologists not to carry out such surveys. There was an increased awareness about the ability of landscape archaeological study to reveal meaningful patterns of human activity because of the limitations of the methods. In other words, it was considered pointless to do a landscape survey and reveal long pattern of human activity, particularly since it was considered that the same patterns could be approached in a more effective way by excavating a multi-period site. And there are many across the Greek countryside. A third factor could have been that the humble, fragmented finds of a landscape survey do not provide the same academic and scientific esteem to the director of the project like finds from the excavation of important sites. Within this context, perhaps it is not surprising that the first systematic, intensive landscape archaeological surveys conducted by Greek archaeologists started in the 90s. It should be also stressed that despite this delay and the lack of a strong national tradition, most of the projects from the 90s onwards follow the latest trends regarding their aims, methodology, and interpretative framework. Postmodern, post-processual criticism on regional surface surveys focused mainly on the notion of landscape and its perception by humans in the past. Postmodern landscape archaeological theory is characterized by the abandonment of the old ecological and demographic explanations and the use of phenomenological approaches to understand the complex relations between humans and the landscape they dwell in. Landscape is not viewed as an environment. Instead, we have the introduction of the term cultural landscapes, which refers to culturally created landscapes due to man's impact on the natural environment. Instead of focusing on ecology, population fluctuations, climate, settlement patterns, and land use, archaeologists study the landscape in relation to time, space, place, memory, movement, and perception. Central place in archaeological research is not to understand the people occupy the landscape, but the way they experienced the landscape with their body, senses, and mind. It is within this context that we see explanations for settlement location choice based on social memory rather than environmental or economic factors. Also, the idea of a culturally constructed landscape brings human agency to the fore. It should be noted, however, that these new approaches focused on reforming the interpretative framework rather than changing the methods and the practice of landscape archaeological survey. The introduction of GIS and the extensive application of interdisciplinary approaches, mainly geoarchaeology, aerial photography, and remote sensing, brought significant changes, but the basic methods of how regional surveys were practiced in the field remained the same: walking transects of plots, collection and recording strategies, etc. This is actually something desirable because standardization of fieldwork methods enhance comparability between surveys. It is confronting to see that all these new trends are being followed in recent landscape projects all over Greece from 2000 onwards by Greek archaeological teams. Some good recent examples of this new wave of regional landscape studies are the surface surveys at Almiros, Karditsa, and Sikion, to name a few conducted by Greek teams of scholars. The same applies to the case of the University of Athens, which until 2000 had not conducted any systematic intensive surveys, only excavations, but over the last 20 years is trying to catch up with 4 surveys in various areas across Greece. It seems that the Greek academic community picked up the thread of landscape survey rather late, but many Greek archaeologists are now fully aware of recent trends concerning practices, methods, techniques, research questions, and interpretative frameworks. To come back to Alexander's yesterday presentation about Serbia, I feel that the lost step in Greek landscape archaeological survey should be placed in the 70s and the 80s. But allow me to come to something different, which was actually triggered by Predrag's today presentation, which in my mind constitutes perhaps the most important challenge of the years to come. Archaeological legislation and archaeological practice over the last 50 years in Greece have led to the formation of 2 types of landscape survey. The first comprised the intensive interdisciplinary surface surveys emerging from specific research questions, covering large areas, lasting for many years, and carried out by large, well-funded scientific teams from Greek or foreign universities. The second type includes the landscape inspection carried out by the archaeologists of the Greek Archaeological Service prior to large-scale construction works. Due to limitations of personnel, funding, time, and equipment, these inspections are rather fast, they cover a small part of the area under threat, and they are carried out by few archaeologists, usually just one. Furthermore, there is a huge gap between the 2 types concerning the dissemination of knowledge. The results of such inspections are not considered worthy of publication, and they are rarely presented as part of the scientific work of the Greek Archaeological Service. The big gap between the 2 types perhaps would not be a problem if we didn't have a significant increase in the amount of large-scale development projects all over Greece, which have created enormous pressure to the Greek Archaeological Service to carry out fast archaeological inspection over large areas. 3 years ago, I was invited by the Greek Archaeological Service to carry out such a rescue or preventive project in the area of East Crete. This project did not stem from my particular research interests. Also, I did not start by setting research questions before the project. The only question was to point possible archaeological sites which could be destroyed by the construction works. So, in a sense, I had to follow a site-oriented survey against the recent trend towards siteless or non-site-oriented surveys, and against other surveys I have conducted or participated to. In other words, I had to be flexible or eclectic in what Predrag said earlier today. Not only this, but as you might expect, there was a pressure to cover a large area of about 2,000 hectares within a limited amount of time, 1 to 2 months, and at a short notice, only 1 month in advance. Due to several limitations, the team had to be small, only 6 archaeologists, but they were highly experienced. Despite the limitations, thanks to the use of GPS and GIS, it was possible to follow all the standardized methods of survey. At the end, it was possible to cover intensively an area of 2,000 hectares within a period of 2 months. Let me see. Yes. We identified around 25 new unknown sites, but we also recorded pottery densities between those sites with a high degree of resolution, trying to do some kind of siteless survey. Furthermore, we had the opportunity to open test trenches in all the identified sites and prove that 80% of them had underground architectural remains and undisturbed deposits beneath the surface. The project was successful in both ways. Our results gave to the Greek Archaeological Service firm evidence to ask for certain alterations of the construction project and even to exclude some areas from this project. On the other hand, the results allowed us to infer archaeological conclusions concerning settlement patterns, land use, and changes in habitation and exploitation of landscape. For example, additionally, because we followed all the standard methods of intensive archaeological survey, the results of our project is comparable to those from other systematic surveys in the area. It was certainly not the ideal situation and not my preferred way to build and execute a landscape survey project, but this was the only way to prevent the irreversible loss of surface information. I would call it methodological flexibility. Predrag again perhaps will call it eclecticism. In any case, the project showed me that a well-organized surface survey stemming not from research archaeological questions, but from unavoidable preventive archaeological work is not only possible, but effective. The results proved valuable and worthy both for preventive and for scientific purposes. Over the last 20 years, large-scale construction and development works have completely altered large parts of the Greek landscape and have caused irreversible loss of valuable archaeological information lying on the surface. With well-planned, intensive surveys, it is possible to overcome this problem and bridge in an effective way the gap between the systematic, intensive surveys of the universities and the fast landscape inspections of the Greek Archaeological Service. Being scientific as well as flexible enough, such surveys can recover the largest amount of information in the least possible time and with the smallest possible cost. The only problem is that such intensive surveys are not a prerequisite for large-scale construction works, at least until now, and therefore their execution is based only on the sensitivities, principles, and code of ethics of the archaeologists of the Greek Archaeological Service. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Yiannis, for this very inspiring and interesting lecture. And I'm sure it would raise a lot of questions from Predrag. I anticipated that large landscape project. So it's all here. And from Denise, and Yorgos. So please, Denise.
Thank you very much for this presentation. Being a student of Jack Davis and a close associate of John Bintliff, I was exposed to survey archaeology in Greece a great deal, and I have always wondered its impact on the development of Greek archaeology. So I would like to thank you for explaining that. It was very, very useful for me. I would like to ask, considering that the foreign institutes have been practicing archaeology in Greece for so long and have been involved in regional surveys, did they not, or what's the level of collaboration with Greek archaeologists? And also, would they include Greek archaeology students in their teams, or are they did they remain rather isolated? Because if you're exposed to this kind of field work, I would expect that Greek students starting from the end of 80s would be also leaning towards carrying out such investigations.
Thank you very much for the question, Denise. The thing is that it takes time. Those teams were not isolated. They had collaborations with Greek archaeologists. They had some students, Greek students from Greek universities, but not in a systematic way. And also, the thing is that it takes time for new generations to start doing something like that. For example, if I can present my personal story, the first time I participated in the early 90s in a Greek survey, it was by students of John Bintliff that had worked 10 years before with him in Boeotia. So it took them 10 years to establish in the beginning of the 90s their own surface survey and then attract some students from Greek universities. So we were participating in such efforts, and definitely we have some kind of relationship with such projects, but still, I mean, the impact was, it took at least 20 years for the Greek archaeologists to start such big regional studies. So I think it's a matter of generation, it's a matter of time.
Thank you.
Thank you. Predrag, please.
Listening to this paper really brings me back to my past experiences. I was doing, and I'm still doing, surveys since late 80s. And actually, we also learned surveying, systematic surveying, and whole ideas behind it from the English colleagues. It similarly brought with the method of more systematic checking of the landscape, also the whole background of settlement pattern, land use organization, and all these things we never asked ourselves before. We had I would say, a fantastic opportunity to test the potential of the surveys personally. Being involved in one project in Hvar, it's an island in central Dalmatia, which has a plain of some 15 square kilometers, and that plain is almost completely covered by a Hellenistic cadastral system. It's the biggest still living cadastral system. So the roads, the walls, the parcels perfectly correspond to Greek cadastre. And also later on, the Romans settled there. Then it was the medieval system of land use of this field, and still today they are using this field mostly for agricultural purposes. Doing survey in this kind of environment, where you have a very clear idea of the space, you knew that you were now in a plethora number 7, which probably would have one Hellenistic larger house. That 5 plethras would mean a huge villa in this, and that in the medieval period there were some other changes. really gave us fantastic idea of fantastic potential when you could associate be it ruins or surface scatters of pottery with this kind of space or this kind of constructed space. And this was really for us astonishing when we realized the potential. And of course, not only just the technically that in a few days' time you can discover 20 new sites, but what to do with these sites. And we have immediately, this was the period when after a year or two, this large motorway project started. And so we have applied, modified, of course, because it's not the same ecological zoning as the Dalmatia in Slovenia. And no one believed us, nothing. And actually, in a few pilot projects, we have discovered with this surveying a series of new sites. So the largest skeptics started to use this and discover sites. In a few years' time, it was obligatory practice for heritage surveys. And this was what I said, that through landscape archaeology, through this kind of analysis and techniques, the new ideas of different archaeological approaches actually got the doors open to this. Nowadays, it's a standard prescription. It's obligatory practice for any kind of project that would, spatial development that would be built on a land that's designated for its cultural heritage. It's done on a large scale, on hundreds of hectares monthly. It's a continuous process. And so in this way, we have actually, I would say, sampled the whole country really, really intensively if you look on a national scale. It was really a success story in our case. It was really a success story. And of course, we modified through time, being more flexible. And also because ecologically, we are dealing with different landscapes and also with different density of archaeological records. In more temperate zones, the archaeological records tend to be not so numerous for certain periods than, for example, in Dalmatia or in Aegean area. But this was really a great success. In 5 years' time, everyone believed in surveys, even too much. That was another problem that we have raised. And that I'm really glad to hear that this kind of idea had also similar echo in Greek case.
Now, to be honest, everybody in Greece, I mean, it does not deny the validity, the value of surveys. The only thing is that the only thing I would like to say on what you said is actually when I was hearing the Slovenian case study in the morning by you, I was jealous a little bit because you set up certain regulations, perhaps too late because of, but still, I mean, these regulations are perfect. And the problem in our case study here is that it's not obligatory to do such intensive surveys. I mean, the Archaeological Service, what is doing and tries to do it in the best possible way is just these inspections, which by no means are anything intensive. So what I would like and what I sometimes beg the ministry, the people in the ministry, is to perhaps to suggest something like that and include this obligation in the archaeological legislation. What we see, however, in the last 3-4 years is that the companies themselves have realized that it's better for them to prevent or to have an archaeologist and pay an archaeologist actually in order to tell them in advance possible gray areas or red areas, so in order to avoid them. But this is because the private companies realize this, not because the ministry, the Greek state, imposed it in some kind of way. But it works a little bit with some private companies. I hope it will be better.
Our problem is being over-regulated. That's another part of the story. Too much regulations. But why surveys or methods of surveys were so successful? Because, especially in heritage sector, in protection sector, because there you actually have to answer few simple questions. Is there any archaeology and where it is? So you don't, I mean, once there is stated that there is archaeology, it falls into the category of protection, and then there are other processes which need to be followed. Doesn't matter is it a Neolithic pottery or is a Roman pottery. It's a heritage, and as such is listed and then goes into different procedures. For academic purposes, of course, this is not enough. But this made a really good, great impact in heritage protection sector, which is not, if it comes in this protection process to the phase when you have to excavate, you already know what you would have, because there are 2-3 stages of surveying and testing before. But for just finding archaeology or from non-archaeology, which is the first step the heritage protection needs to do in case of this kind of threats, like a building of new industrial plants or whatever, into tourist development, this is enough. And this is why survey was so successful.
Thank you. Yorgos, please. I'm sorry, Yiannis, perhaps you have...
No, everything is okay. Yeah.
Okay, sorry. Yorgos, please.
Thank you, Yiannis. Thank you for the presentation. My question really is, it has to do with this the research agenda. In the framework you described, of course, it was impossible to have a goal-oriented survey at Itanos. But I would say that if we're going to really tackle the issue of empiricism that has been troubling us during this conference and not only, I would say that this is a challenge to be able to have a goal-oriented agenda before we do even rescue operations. And to have a proper preventive archaeology than rescue archaeology, because they are different. And in different countries, they have tested different solutions. In RAP in France, for really preventing excavations, or what they did in Ireland, where universities, local authorities, and the local archaeologists and the developers sat down and created a research agenda, a long-term research agenda. And I was wondering, what would you suggest on this? And for the rest of the audience, Yiannis Papadatos has made tremendous efforts to cooperate with the local archaeological service. He has a series of cooperative projects, and he has achieved what I don't think it's unique, in the sense that a lot of students have also been trained in these projects, which is amazing. So, do you think that this personal experience that you have yourself, okay, we could push it a bit further and I don't know, establish ground rules for other cases, so as to be able to have a kind of a research agenda at some point?
Yorgos, this would be my dream, but I not in order to present my own agenda or to pass my own agenda, pass anybody's agenda, to be honest. I mean, for me, the important thing is, before any construction project, to have intensive surveys like the ones we do as part of our projects, survey projects. The only problem is that every time I try to present this in public fora, they raise their shoulders and say, okay, why not? But perhaps I should be a little bit more, I should push it a little bit more. After all, everything is about legislation. You know that legislation in Greece does not, unfortunately, change very often and easily. The archaeological law is dated back to 2002, and God knows when it's going to change again or to be something to be added. That's why, to be honest, I have more faith actually to the private sector, because I know that over the last 3-4 years, big private companies, construction companies, as I said to Predrag before, they realize that it's for their own sake to have archaeologists as part of in their payroll, in order to protect them from going to red areas, gray areas, or areas with antiquities. I'll try to continue on this, but and to be honest, if at some point I will be able to persuade some people in the ministry and change legislation and make obligatory what Frederick said about Slovenia, obligatory such surveys before construction works, then yes, it will be perfect to have a theoretical framework and several research questions related to this particular type of surface survey. But before this, to build up a whole research construction or a theoretical approach to something that is not the normal, I think it's pointless. And this particular case, it was within 1 month. They called me and they had to do something within 1 month. So build which research questions, I mean, think of what theoretical framework. The idea was very simple, try to save as much as surface information as possible. That was the main goal. But if this continues in the future, yes, you're absolutely right. We need to think in a more general way about this way of work and field work.
Thanks.
Thank you. If I'm not mistaken, this concludes our discussion on Yiannis' lecture and on the conference itself. I'd like to thank the organizers one more for this really wonderful and very important conference, if I may say so. We've seen a lot of common traits, and common denominator of this whole conference is are certain mutual topics and which are intertwined between history of discipline, methodology and theory, and local rather in one respect similar cases than in other in a range of chronological and geographical differences, but there are definitely mutual topics, and perhaps I guess it would be good now to give a word to organizers, Diana, Dimitris, perhaps to give some concluding remarks of this conference, and I thank you.
Thank you, Alexander. Thank you. I certainly have something to say, but before that, I would like to give the floor to Dimitris and Alec. I mean, you choose who is going to speak first, and then I'll come at the very end.
Well, I can go first. I don't have much to say. Thank you, everyone, for being here with us these 2 days. It was a great pleasure. I wish things were different. I wish we were together in a room in an auditorium in Sofia right now. However, this was as good as it could get. Concluding remarks means that there were some conclusions. I don't think there were any, and but perhaps this is a good thing. The general idea is that archaeology in our region followed the political, economic, and social fortunes of the region over the last, well, couple of centuries or so, and certainly during the 20th century. Wars, certainly, civil wars, more certainly, fascism, Nazism, communism, and in more recent years in this century, what some might describe, and I would certainly describe, as an effort to turn the states we're in, as it were, into neoliberal dystopias. We did discuss about a new way of looking at the history of our archaeologies, the archaeologies of our present time. And I think we would all agree that we need to continue this discussion. It has been extremely revealing for me, enlightening really, And I was thinking, at some point today, I don't remember exactly when, I was thinking that perhaps we should, for next year or the year after that, we should each try to study each other's examples. Perhaps I should study Serbian archaeology or Bulgarian, and some of you might do the Greek example, because as archaeologists, I think we all know that, and this is an old empiricist dogma, that when we look at the familiar with an unfamiliar way, we are better equipped to understand it. But archaeologists always turn artifacts upside down and try to make sense of them. So I think we are perhaps a bit too familiar with our own histories, because they are our own histories. History of Greek archaeology is the history of Greece, and by now I've lived quite a lot of it. So I think this is the case with everyone. Exchanging stories from the front, as it were, makes us wiser, and I think eventually we might come up by the third conference of this series. The third year of this series, we might come up with a new manifesto, but not now, not today.
Yes, I want to thank everyone for making this conference such an enlightening, uplifting, and lively event. I will mention only one of the many important ideas presented here. The idea put forward by Radu Dragoman and Sasha Babbage that disciplinary change might come from our ethical concerns and emotions, things that many of us were trained to ignore in order to become good archaeologists. The excellent presentations and discussions showed particularities and commonalities in the regional traditions of research, and also that we should continue inquiring about how archaeology is thought and practiced, something that it is fruitful, especially as a collective endeavor. The inquiry about why we have these archaeologies and not something different, an inquiry that could lead to ways of bringing change, requires looking as a discipline from the outside, and therefore requires to develop our ability to see ourselves as exotic, and also cooperation with researchers from other disciplines. One of the outcomes of such an endeavor could be the development of our capacity to separate what we change from what we cannot. Thank you.
Thank you, Dimitris. Thank you, Alec. Of course, I wholeheartedly join in this, in thanking all of you for this very inspiring, very moving 2 days. I should say that on the basis of my experience with a number of similar events and in different formats, I'm really impressed by the degree of convergence, of coherence that our 2 days work demonstrated in terms of a hidden agenda. That is, in terms of the questions we commonly share as important, in terms of the challenges, methodological and theoretical challenges we commonly consider, we jointly consider to be of relevance and importance. And this is very, very rare for people who meet for the first time. And I was wondering who was to be held responsible for it, whether it is our two directors who framed the topic so well and coherently, or to the participants. I think to both. But anyway, I'm really fascinated and grateful for this basic consensus and convergence of interests and concerns as well. So it is obvious that what we had here was, as Dimitris also pointed out, on the one hand, or rather Alexander, I think at his concluding remarks, that we had the side by side, we could see the similarities and we could see the differences. And I think that the most valuable part of this kind of exercise, and what Dimitris said we should continue to do, is to try to look at our own tradition, national traditions, from the vantage point of other national traditions. This is capable, this is not only the heuristics of comparison, but it is also a way of rethinking our own discipline, our own experience, and ego history, if you wish. To my mind, I could see basically two within the presentations yesterday and today. I think that there were two approaches that in different degrees, in different ratios, predominated in some presentations, and others predominated in other presentations. Namely, one that a part of the presentations was centering more, focusing more on the history or the trajectory of archaeological knowledge, and these were the bigger part of the presentations yesterday, plus maybe Rajna's presentation today. And I could also see another cluster of presentations that were more focused on theoretical and methodological issues like Dimitris's, Monica's, Staša's, Predrag's, Yiannis's, and so on. And it seems to me, I don't know what you think of it, maybe it might be too early to think of that, even though my impression is not exactly this. I haven't encountered, probably you have, you'll tell me, but I don't think there exists such a publication of sorts that would bring together all these kind of experiences. Most of you, if not all of you, are teaching also at universities. And I think that some kind of publication that would bring these national cases together would be very useful also for teaching. I don't know what you think of it. We just think of it and let us digest it and see where it makes sense. It could be open access, it could be printed out. We can just let us think about it, because it seems to me that there is much in what we heard these couple of days that should not remain just in our genuinely thoughtful community. That thought community, this is beyond any question at this point, that if we form a thought community, but just to also reach out to a bigger audience of professionals, especially younger professionals and so on, which does not preclude what Dimitris and Alex said in terms of continuing our cross-national negotiations, discussions, and so on, and education, cross-national education, of course. But it seems to me that such a volume would be an asset also for teaching purposes. Any first reactions to this? As I said, we can postpone this, happily postpone it for a later date, but I was thinking that I could see Staša is in favor of it. Now we can just think in this direction and keep it in mind that it is a possibility. I can discuss this with Getty as well, by the way, so that they could help us also with some editing costs at least, because as noted many times, we are not, none of us is a native speaker, English native speaker. Yeah. Okay, Monica too. Well, that's a good idea. Good. Yeah, I guess little by little, we will gather the critical mass of supporters for such an idea. All right, but at this point, I would give you, any one of you, the floor if you want to add something before we close down. You know that from tomorrow on, we continue with our spring school. All of you are invited to listen to some of the lectures, to all of it as you please. Certainly, you're most warmly welcome as long as you have the time and the wish to do so.
Just thank you for all of this.
Yes, thank you from me as well for including Turkey, because you seem to share a language amongst yourselves, but Turkey kind of remains peripheral to the the changing dynamics in the Balkans in terms of archaeological research. So I'm very happy to have met all of you and heard your stories and your approaches. And I would really like to stay in touch and be part of future projects. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Dennis. Thank you very much. Now,
Thank you very much. This was great experience. I hope we will continue in some sort.
yeah, I mean, anyway, there are 2 more spring schools and a closing conference as well. So there is much to look forward to. And to the extent that the topics of the forthcoming 2 schools of interest to any of you, do let us know, and we will gladly devise a way to include you also more actively in this, not just as an audience, as part of the of just attending it.
Okay, well, the only thing missing was the live contact between the people, actually.
Absolutely. Thank you for
having an opportunity to really informally elaborate upon many issues. It is also a very important part of each and every conference. So
absolutely,
the organizers are obliged to make it happen sometime in real life, so that we can all meet up even for a day, just to see everybody as real people, not only images on my computer.
Yeah, very well, Staša. I mean, when I was thinking about this really quite unusual convergence, I mean, and you could see that all these papers, they speak to each other. I was also thinking, I cannot even dream what would have happened if we had the dinners, the lunches, you know, and the walks and all this informal ambience to share our to share anything. So
well, which are usually well, at least equally productive as the official part of the conference. So.
Absolutely, absolutely. So we will definitely try to compensate for it one way or the other.
I'm convinced that the convergence would be even greater with some fine Bulgarian wine.
Absolutely, no doubt. No doubt. I also had this in mind, indeed. Okay, so thank you very much indeed to all of you. Do stay in touch. We will do likewise. So let us think of indeed coming back to yesterday's question, what next? This is what we could look forward to. Very well. Thank you very much.